Good night.
Okay. Let's go ahead and we'll jump into this other kind of this will be kind of an appendix to our time together here. And I don't have as much plan to talk about on this because honestly I didn't want to plan on it and run out of time and promise you guys something that we were going to get. So basically what I want to talk about is just how did we get the Bible as it is right now? You know, the collection of the books of the Bible. A lot of people have questions about that because obviously, if you didn't know this before, you probably do after today. It wasn't written and intended to be one volume. You know, that wasn't maybe God intended that, but certainly the writers of the Bible did not have that in mind when they wrote. You know, they had other purposes in mind. Later on, other people collected those writings into one place. So, just understanding that was never the point. Like the writer of Chronicles wasn't like, well, someday, my book's going to be after Kings, and so I better, whatever. Like they just weren't thinking that way, And so, same thing with the New Testament. Did Paul know that he was writing Scripture? I don't know. I mean, he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians, right? We have those books, but we know there were at least 2 other letters to the church of Corinth that we don't have. That was like Corinthians 1.5 and Corinthians 2.5, right? And we don't have those letters anymore. We don't know. Were those ones not inspired Scripture, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians were, and so they made it, and the other 2 didn't. It's the whole thing of how does that whole inspiration thing work, as well as the collection of the writings. So there's tons and tons we could say about this, but I'm going to give you kind of the thumbnail sketch of it. Okay. So you guys have the timeline here. I'll make some references to some of that, but basically, the events of the Old Testament were written down, usually right around the time of those, or like a generation or 2 after the events of that. Okay, so like we saw in the book, the events of the Judges, those events were recorded, later after Israel had a king. At some point, the events of the Judges were written down. So those stories were probably transmitted, orally until somebody, through those stories being told, spoken, until somebody wrote them down, right? In terms of the kings going on, like a lot of times there was somebody who was writing down the actions of the kings, and then those were collected. But in the case of the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, for example, those books were written during the exile, while the Jews were in exile, to explain how they got there, right? And to explain how they were released from exile. So there's specific purposes to each of these books being written, just like the books of the New Testament. Does that make sense? So they were written, and what happened was that during that intertestamental period we talked about, there was an effort by the Jewish people to gather those books, or really at that time they were like scrolls, to gather them together and to preserve them, to get them collected so that they could be safely taken care of. Does that make sense? Because there's a lot of war going on, there's a lot of conflicts and stuff like that, and so they're trying to collect those and hang on to them. That was like about 400 BC to the time of Jesus' birth is when, remember there was all that turmoil, Alexander the Great, Hellenism coming in, and the different influences that are going on, the Maccabean revolts, stuff like that. So during that time, it became really important, and during the time of the exile as well, a few hundred years before that, when Jerusalem's getting destroyed by the Babylonians. It's like, oh man, everything's getting burned and destroyed. Grab the scrolls, let's keep them safe, type deal. And so, my point is that stuff was collected, not hey, we need to get the Old Testament together, guys, but really it's collected because we need to keep these writings, we need to preserve these writings. We need to make sure they don't get destroyed or whatever, because they're important. It's part of our cultural identity. We need to have these. Now, in terms of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, those were probably written down pretty early, because in I think it's in Deuteronomy, it talks about when you have a king, in the future, when you end up with a king, the king needs to have the law. And that he needs to have that as a reference, and it needs to be part of his, his library and part of his rule. So the king is supposed to have a copy of the Pentateuch at all times that he's reading and working on, and not, and working off of as part of his rule. So we know that was written down pretty early. There's scrolls and the Hebrew scriptures and stuff like that. Was there a hand over here?
I was just, it was my understanding, or how it was explained to me anyway, and I just wanted that with you, that urge to preserve was basically, at that time, they were squashing cultures, any opposition, and part of that assimilation for, that one rule, easy to maintain, as Andrew the Great was doing his thing. They just pretty much would wash you out of whatever it was you were here now, their culture. So,
perfect. Yep, absolutely. And so all of a sudden, and remember, the focus by the time of Jesus is more on study, right? And so we do know there was copies of the Jewish scriptures, all over the place. We have record of Jesus going to the synagogue in Nazareth, and they hand him the scroll of Isaiah, right? And he opens it and he starts reading, and he basically says, "This scripture is about me. It's fulfilled today in your presence." And he's reading from the Isaiah scroll that they have a copy of, right? So pretty crazy. And I do think that probably most of those scriptures were Greek, were Septuagint scriptures. So to kind of give you guys a quick overview, we'll jump into the New Testament. The Septuagint was created in, as you can see, the second one down there, 250 to 200. Basically, Jews who lived in Alexandria, which is in Egypt there, they, supposedly there were 70 of them, that's hence the name Septuagint, just means 70 to 70. They took the Hebrew scriptures and they translated them into into Greek, and at that point collected it all into one place. Okay, and that translation also included some other books, which are called the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanonical books. And so, that's why I asked the question earlier about those with a Hebrew or a Catholic background or an Eastern Orthodox background, because they have other books in their Bible that are from that Septuagint translation. Books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the additions to the book of Daniel, and books like that, which are actually interesting to read. I mean, they're helpful to read. I'm not against it at all. But I think a lot of the early church fathers thought, these books are valuable to read. Be careful about getting a lot of doctrine and theology from them. That's not really their purpose. So that's my view on the Apocrypha. If you want to read the Apocrypha, I think it's fun to read, especially Maccabees. I think that would make a great movie. It's like the 4 Maccabean brothers. There's 4 of them, and basically they get oppressed, and one Maccabean brother kind of reminds me of the Chinese brothers? What's that old story? The 5 Chinese brothers or whatever it is, and they all. But anyway, one Maccabean brother would lead a revolt, and they would win, and then he would end up getting killed, and then the next Maccabean brother would rise up and they would fight, and then he got killed, and they just kept. But there's more brothers, you just imagine, and you're like, oh, another brother, another Maccabean, But it's pretty cool story, a lot of battles, and it's really interesting and historical, So if you want to read, First Maccabees, or there's all kinds of. But those books were mostly written in that, that middle period between the Testaments, and they were part of that Septuagint translation. And like I said, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the portions of the Old Testament that are included in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like Isaiah and books like that, they immediately took them, and as they got a hold of them, and started comparing them to the Septuagint. So they're comparing the Hebrew of those to the Septuagint, which was supposedly translated from those scriptures, and they're pretty close. Now there's another Hebrew translation we have, it's the Masoretic text, that there was a whole other group of Jews that were, even after the time of Jesus, the centuries after Jesus, continued to translate or copy the Hebrew scriptures. And those, there are some differences between what's called the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, even though the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text are both Hebrew, the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually closer to the Septuagint, the Greek translation, than they are to the Masoretic text. There's quite a few differences. And so the Septuagint is pretty authoritative in terms of being a good translation and matching up with stuff that we found that's earlier, if that makes sense. So that's kind of how the Old Testament came to be. The New Testament, and we're not going to get into the later translations into English and stuff like that with Tyndale and stuff like that, but that's really interesting stuff. But just to talk about the New Testament, pretty early on, like as in the first 100 years after Jesus, the four Gospels were pretty quickly grouped together, and there was a new technology called the Codex. And what it was like the early form of a book. Because, up till that point, it was scrolls or it was parchments or whatever. That, for the first time, they were starting to do kind of that book-style binding. And it was really portable. And so the early Christians pretty quickly grabbed a hold of that as a technology to use, because they're traveling all over the place, right? And the gospel's spreading. And they put the four gospels together pretty early on. I'm thinking 150 AD to 200 AD, which you can consider the book of John was written maybe the late 80s or late 70s AD. That's pretty soon after that. And it's pretty cool that those four gospels, which kind of all tell the story of Jesus from a different perspective, the Christians were like, it's really important for us to have all four of these together and to read them together as a whole. And so that's kind of the very first glimpse we have of the Bible, of the New Testament being a collection of books, was those four Gospels being transported. And then maybe add in the book of Acts along with that. So they're going around, but really same thing with the Old Testament being compiled. The main reason the New Testament was compiled is because people started teaching weird stuff about Jesus and God, and one of the first guys was a guy named Marcion, and Marcion had these weird beliefs about the God of the Old Testament is a completely different God than the God of the New Testament, and here's the proof of that, and he had just really weird heretical views, and he put together his own set of writings. He took, some of Paul's writings that he thought, supported his view. He took Luke and took some sections out that he didn't agree with and put those together. He started building his own kind of New Testament, so to speak. And the other Christians were like, whoa, that guy's whack. We need to do something quick. And so they started making lists saying, these books are books we believe are authoritative, and these books aren't. And so far they hadn't put anything together, but they started establishing and making lists. Now the word canon, when you see the word canon or canonize, canon just means rule. It literally means measuring stick. That's what the word canon means. And so the Christians basically said, we need to decide what are our books and what aren't. What books are in basically and what books aren't. And that's going to be our measuring stick. Now, sometimes we get it backwards. We think, you get somebody like a Dan Brown or whatever that thinks that the Catholic Church is this huge conspiracy and they changed the scriptures and, Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus or whatever. And then they have all these, what that doesn't take into account is, the picture we get from somebody like a Dan Brown is the church from the very beginning has complete control over all the writings. And so if they wanted to, they could turn around and they could change stuff in the writings, and it's changed. But that's not the landscape of the early church at all. There are copies and copies and copies of stuff everywhere, traveling around. Because if I have a parchment, if I've got the book of Ephesians on a parchment, I know this isn't going to last very long, right? Because it's pretty fragile, right? And I'm carrying it everywhere. It's being read, it's being taken places. So what's the first thing I'm going to do as quickly as I can? I'm going to make a copy of it, right? By hand, obviously. And that's what would happen. And I want it as accurate as possible because pretty soon this original is going to be gone, and I need a copy, right? So pretty soon you've got copies everywhere. You've got copies of the Gospels out there. You've got copies of New Testament letters. Paul expected and knew his letters would be read in all kinds of different places. And so copies and copies and copies everywhere. And pretty soon, by the time the Pope is more established and stuff like that, you've got monasteries everywhere that have, copies of things. In order for the church to change everything, they would have to go and get a hold of all those copies and change all of them, right? Logistically impossible. So as far as the idea of the church having real control over those writings for the first couple hundred years, they really didn't. Okay? And that's actually a good thing. You might think, oh, that's bad, but it's actually good because what it shows is the books that made it into the final cut were the books that were really important. And the books that everybody, when they got together, they said, oh, well, yeah, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those have got to go in. Oh, yeah, the book of Romans, that's got to go in. And there would be some debate like, oh, the book of Hebrews, even from early on, we're not really sure who wrote that. Should that be in or shouldn't it be in? Well, does it disagree with these other books that we know are written by an apostle and are authoritative and all these churches are using them? No? Okay, no one's included. Well, I don't know, the book of 2 Peter, it's a little bit weird. We're not totally sure if Peter wrote it or not. Well, does it line up with these other books that books we know are written by an apostle and are authoritative in the churches? Yeah, okay, then let's put it in. So that's kind of how they would do it. So instead of this idea, it's kind of backwards from what the conspiracy theorists say. Instead of the church having authority over all these writings and deciding what went in and what didn't, instead, it's flipped. What writings seem to have authority in the church? Let's gather the writings that already have established authority in the church, that we have decided to put ourselves under the teachings of these writings. Let's put them all in one place. And why? Why should we put them all in one place? Well, because all these other belief systems are coming against us, and we need to establish what it is that we are about and what it is that we're not about. And that's where the 27 books of the New Testament came from. Now, there's a lot of books that didn't make the cut that the early church was using and spreading around. And if they didn't make the cut, it's because there was enough objection that they decided just to leave it out. It's kind of the whole when in doubt, leave it out thing. Okay? So that's why when you read the New Testament, it has a lot of different perspectives in it, but it really is one cohesive message. It's because the church at that time had elevated these certain writings to a place of authority amongst them, which is really cool if you think about it, because there's churches everywhere, right? So the fact that one particular book would rise to the top as being, or certain books would rise to the top as being authoritative for all these different churches is pretty cool. Because it's not, communication was hard, travel was hard, all those things were hard. So this process was actually relatively fast, how quickly the Bible came together, the New Testament, and there's no way it could have been, organized in order to spread a particular agenda. It just wasn't going to work that way. Does that make sense? So then once they had the New Testament, then by that point the Old Testament was established in the Septuagint, and they put the two of them together. Luther, when Martin Luther came along, he is the one who moved the Apocrypha to the end of the Old Testament and said, I don't think these books are authoritative. I don't think they should be in the Old Testament anymore. And that's when they started moving away from that, establishing the 39 books of the Old Testament. And that's kind of the beginning of that. Obviously, there's way more to the story in terms of it getting translated to English. And there was times when if you translated the Bible into English from Latin, it was a death sentence. I mean, that people got killed for that. So pretty crazy. But then you got the printing press that came along, and just it was really important to certain people throughout history that people be able to have a copy of the Bible in their language, and it's still a big initiative today with Bible translators and missionaries and things like that. It's so important, and people take it on themselves, and people have died. People have lost everything in order for the Bible to come to us as it is today, which is, when you think about it, it's really humbling. I've got like 14 Bibles on my shelf at home, and how often do I grab one and read it and appreciate, not just the original writers, but those who translated and compiled and traveled and copied and did all that kind of stuff to bring the Bible together.